I want to welcome you, Chris Silva, the Executive Director of the Custom House Maritime Museum, to our April First Friday. It's going to be a great presentation. We're honored to have Dr. William Freeman here, 6 generations removed from the Holy Terror. William Nichols, thank you for being here, it's an honor. And Jeffrey Briggs, the sculptor who did the legendary New Reporters and the new Nichols sculpture downstairs. Please, when you have a chance, get down there and take a look at it. It's absolutely fantastic. Our next First Friday in May will be a presentation by Ted Olson, one of our docents. And in June, we'll have no other than Bob Cronin, our chairman of the Maritime Days and the Tall Ship. So it's going to be a great next couple months of presentations. This came about, we had a conversation with Dr. Nichols last fall in regards to Dr. Freeman about Captain Nichols, and we had a conversation with Jeff Briggs about doing 2 additional sculptures for the legendary New Reporters, and it made sense to have William Nichols as the next sculpture. It came out fantastic, and it was done with a generous gift from Newport Bank. And I'd like to thank anyone that's associated with them for getting that done for us. Without your support, we could not do that. So with no hesitation, I'd like to have Dr. Freeman come up and start the presentation.
Old age is definitely overrated. My wife was going to be here, but she decided she couldn't. She's had a recurrence of her cancer, and it may have to be a cell B blood removal. Sounds very complicated. And she said, no, I just can't make it. And my son was going to come, but this is a very important day working in a food market. Today, of course, is a religious day for many people, and he is very busy in Kansas City working on the produce. He's in charge of the produce. All of the artifacts that I grew up with from ages 3 till 10 in my grandmother's house, all of Nichols' artifacts were there. She was an only child of an only child, and all of Nichols' artifacts got kind of relegated to her. So I grew up with all of the artifacts that you see in this museum about Captain Nichols kind of around the house, just as regular objects in the house. I didn't see them as artifacts, and it was interesting to kind of see that they are now on display here after myself and my 11 cousins who are also related to Captain Nichols remembers well. His picture was hanging on the 2nd story landing. As you would go down 2 or 3 steps, then you turn. His picture was right there. Every time you go down the stairs, his dark eyes were going right through you. And my cousins who would visit quite regularly felt the same way. It's his eyes. It's his eyes that are doing it. And my grandfather died, and the artifacts got spread around to the family, and another cousin of mine and I took the time to bring everything together, which was a task, to bring everything together, because they started to go down to the next generation. You see the portrait. There's a whole story behind the fire buckets that you'll see downstairs. I don't know if some of you know that the fire buckets were originally owned by his father, Captain William Nichols, also a privateer. And he was a member of the Newburyport Marine Society, made up of shipmasters. And the agreement among the shipmasters was every member had to have 2 buckets right beside their front door in case any member would have a fire. So that the 2 fire buckets are literally fire buckets that were made and then passed on to William Nichols Jr. And there was a telescope which is down there, which I owned for a while when my uncle gave it to me, and it's an amazing telescope that takes very fine unscrewing of 5 lenses. If you see the telescope, there are 5 lenses, I know. My uncle showed me, and that's been donated by my uncle here. And then the other thing, I don't know if, if you go downstairs, you'll see that there was a photo of the harpy, which was made for his last voyage after he was out of prison. And he had the fastest sailing ship on the seas at that point. He was never caught. He was caught with the Decatur, but he was not caught with the harpy. Some people wonder what motivated me to write the book, The Holy Terror, Captain William Nichols. Well, probably because he lived with me all my life. And my grandmother was very proud of the fact that she had the heritage from Captain Nichols. In addition to the fact that I learned about Captain Nichols from a family tree, which kind of showed me going down to the 6th generation. Also, Sidney Chase wrote a book wrote a series of articles in the vernacular, which I couldn't really understand. And he ended up submitting it to the Scribner's magazine back in 2016, I believe. And my grandmother was given, he was a friend to my grandmother, and he gave her a 14-page vernacular outline of what happened with Captain Nichols. That's how I got to know Captain Nichols. It was important for me as I got older that something more needed to be done than just what was done so far. And I said, I got to write a book. I got to write a book about Captain Nichols. And so you've seen perhaps copies of the book. We have them here on sale. The Holy Terror, Captain William Nichols. The other artifact which I made sure did not get donated to the museum was an 1804 5-shilling coin, which has on one side a hole drilled through as a watch fob, and then his name in circular engraving, which was new at that point, went around in a circle, Captain William Nichols Jr. And the story of this is that he was in prison for a year and a half when prisoners got released from the British prisons. They were given a 5-shilling coin to get back home. He didn't use it. This is the coin that was given to him when he got discharged and released from the British prisons. And it will not be given to the museum. My son has dibs on it. William Nichols was born in 1781 towards the end of the Revolutionary War. His father had fought as a privateer captain. He'd been in the fiasco that happened in the Penobscot Bay, and he survived, but when young William was 3 years old, his father died. So he and his younger brother, by about 2 years, had the run of the mill around Market Square. They lived 2 blocks from here on Middle Street. If you know where Middle Street is, it's just right up the road. And they lived on Middle Street, and he and his brother had the run of the mill in Market Square with all of the hubbub that was going on in Market Square, with all of the ship construction, everything that was happening, a lot of merchant work, going in and out of Newburyport. And he, because his father had been a member of the Newburyport Marine Society, the members of the Marine Society, because Captain Nichols Sr. had passed away, began to mentor young William, as well as his next door neighbor, who was Captain Nicholas Pierce, who was also a shipmaster. And between Captain Pierce and the members of the Marine Society, they taught him all about navigation and how to sail. He probably visited China in merchant ships before he ever visited Salem, Mass. Because that was what happened with 10 or 11-year-old boys. They would be put on ships as monkeys, and they were traveling around the world. And the Pierce family, who lived next door, were very close to them, and William ended up marrying Lydia, their daughter. So there was a connection between the Pierce and the Nichols family. Lydia's mother died when she was 14 years old. She then, being the oldest of 7 children, took the responsibility of having to raise, with her father, the kids in the Pierce family. And she developed a close relationship, of course, with young William, and they ended up getting married a little bit later on. In the early part of Captain Nichols' career on the sea, it was some incidents that happened before the war ever started. He and his brother, as young adults, continued their father's merchant marine business across the seas. And he, at age 18, was on a ship that was captured by a French privateer. Now, impressment was a big issue for the war that started eventually. Impressment is when, at that time, Britain and France were at war. They needed men for their navies. The way they got the men is that they would raid American ships, steal all the men, and have them work on their ships. And they had a choice. Either you work for us on our ships, or we throw you overboard. It's as simple as that. So that most men reluctantly would start fighting for either the French or the British. When he was 18 years old, he was on a merchant ship with Captain Pierce called the Rose, and it was overtaken by a French privateer. They captured the crew, but Captain Chase and young William were able to escape into Guadalupe and up in the St. Thomas Mountains. And he eventually got himself back to Boston and to Newburyport. In 1805, when he was 24 years old, he married Lydia, and the two of them continued their lineage down to my grandmother, my mother, myself. In 1807, this is still before the war, he was 26 years old and was appointed as a shipmaster. And the first ship that he took out was called the Sally Ann. And the Sally Ann was captured by a French privateer. And they took all of his men, and then he was going to try to continue to go to Britain, and he was captured again by the British. He ended up telling his story to the British authorities, and they released him. They said, well, you've been through enough, go home. So he did, and then in 1807, a couple of things happened in this town that was significant. The first one is in 1807, there was the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act is something that Newburyport hated, absolutely hated. 80% of the population in Newburyport were Federalists, and they did not like the fact that the Embargo Act would prevent any trade going between our country and Britain. It destroyed the economy of Newburyport as a result of that. It was so unpopular that the Embargo Act was repealed in a year's time. And Newburyport was kind of left devastated. A little bit later, on May 31st, 1811, still before the war, Newburyport had the Great Fire. It had devastated all of downtown Newburyport, and it burned up to the intersection where Captain Nichols was on one side and Captain Pierce was on the other corner. It took Captain Pierce's house, did not take the Nichols home. He survived that piece. But it was If you read about the Great Fire in Newburyport, it was terrible. It was terrible. Many of the codes now that require brick buildings came from that fire, because it just went up in a conflagration at that point. Now that was on May 31st, 1811. Captain Nichols was on the seas at that time. He was sailing the Alert. This is before the war. And on July 6, 1811, he had the British capture him. They took most of his crew, except for himself and a couple of cabin boys, and their prize crews were the crew that came from the privateers to take people back to the harbor in Britain. The Alert, he was kept on the Alert as that ship was going to go to Britain. And he took his own ship back. That's part of why he's called the Holy Terror, by British officers calling him, watch out for Nichols on the seas. What happened was he had used the cabin boys to lure the men from down below, one by one, to come up. He would beat them up, tie them up, and I believe it was 7 or 8 of the members of the prize crew taking the ship back to Britain were all tied up. And he then decided, what do I do with these 7 guys? I'm just here with a couple of cabin boys sailing. He said, I'm going to set them free. Now, he had a choice. You could throw them overboard. You could shoot them and kill them. Instead, what he did was he set up a boat that had oars, a sail, a compass, food, maps, and set them free out of sight of land. And that was it. You're on your own. He did not shoot him or throw him overboard. He could have. Some officers, would have done that. And that whole story resonated entirely through the British Navy. Not only had he recaptured his own ship and then let 7 or 8 people go. And then what happened was that he was able to kind of recover, and he wasn't captured. He kind of made it back to Newburyport. And then the war started, and the Decatur, the ship that he started with. Now remember that this town was all Federalists. They were against the war. They were against the Americans going to war, and getting a Decatur with 160 men to be able to be free, to be able to go on to his ship was a task. And he was able to do it the day before he took off with the Decatur, sailed out of Newburyport. He marched all of his men up State Street, across High Street, to the owner of the Decatur, singing Yankee Doodle Dandy the whole way. And then they took off. Now, the popularity of him at that point was kind of spawned by Ellen. editor Ellen in the paper saying, quote, "This town is disgraced with but 2 privateers, one of which is the Decatur, fit out by Democrats with Captain William Nichols, but they are not likely ever to set the river on fire." That was kind of his lasting kind of comment. Now, I think my time is up, right? I wanted to take you through what happened with the Decatur and the Constitution, but I do not have the time. So,
But it's in your book.
what?
Is it not in your book?
Oh, you can find it in the book.
Just to sum up Captain Nichols, he was a naval war hero. He was fearless and daring privateer who captured 28 British vessels, 600 prisoners. And on all the time he was in prison half that time. He escaped 3 times and he captured his own ship. As you can see, Captain Nichols was a very dynamic individual. Creating a sculpture of him completed a personal vision that I had hoped to have him be added to the 18th century Parthenon of Newburyport's significant individuals. I've learned a lot about creating a depiction of a historic individual over the last 4 years. The first task is to gather as much visual information about the person's physical appearance as possible. Portraiture, if you have it, height, body structure, facial features. Fortunately for Nichols, the historic record has a full physical description of him. The only one in the whole collection of figures in the show. I studied clothing. Gotta get this together here. Studied clothing, styles of the period, and what would this person be wearing because of his or her social status and profession. This is from the portrait downstairs, this image here. And this image is from the graphic in the back. I've been told that the graphic was created from the image. This is another portrait. One of the prominent items in the museum is Nichols' telescope. I gathered pictures of people holding telescopes. That's what this is down here. The next task in creating a historic figure's design is deciding on the pose. How do you position this person to convey a certain attitude to the viewer? This requires character research. I studied the period of history a person has lived through and how that may have affected their persona. I have found this requires the knowledge of an historian that has specialized in the subject matter. After reading The Holy Terror by Dr. Friedman, my first impression was Nichols' personality was of a risk taker, an adventurer, favoring extreme or violent confrontation, a militant person not too much different than the pirates of the day. I collected pictures of how Hollywood depicts pirates. How do they portray aggression, defiance in their characters? Note the muscular stance, the upright stance, the shoulders thrown back, chest pushed out, and chin held high, and eyes in a look of defiance. Akin to the facial features you see on Nichols' portrait. In my communications with Dr. Friedman, I expressed these thoughts. He pointed out that Nichols' temperament would have to be far more complex than that. In order to keep command of a chaotic, privateering voyage, a leader must quickly interpret the events happening around him and stay in control. We know he was combative and aggressive in support of social and political causes, a militant personality similar to our present-day Special Forces soldiers. We can project that Nichols exhibited a defensive, aggressive persona, especially as a young man, perhaps an inflated sense of self-importance, a tendency to take offense at anything that was said about him, projecting to others, my humanity makes me better than you. Now all the factors are in place to develop a composition for Nichols, a militant personality showing confidence, determination, and defiance, and at the same time showing uncertainty. Show him at the height of his physical prowess. Show authority. He should have militant-looking clothing, but Nichols was never in the military, so it cannot be a uniform. Show symbols of command of a sea captain: helm, cutlass, flintlock, spyglass. I was advised by Dr. Freeman, that Nichols would have low-cut shoes used during ship life. The first portion of the sculpture would have to be created was the helm. I made a quick study of ship helm construction. I learned that the majority of helms of large sailing ships had 10 spokes. The size of the helm would be determined by the size of the figure. The half-inch diameter spokes of the wheel were individually turned on a lathe. The helm is a wood construction. This is called the armature. The armature is a wire structure used to rigidly hold the clay in place. It is made of aluminum wire and epoxy. I use aluminum because aluminum wire is soft and the clay has no tensile strength. Exterior structure is required. I make a temporary base for the modeling purpose. So this is the base, which is a temporary base. The base is engineered so that the helm can be removed. The legs of the armature are bolted to the base for additional stability. Oil-based clay has been heated to make it pliable. Once it cools, it can be carved. This is the first few hours of modeling. This is the progression you'll see from right to left. That's what we did with a slideshow. At this point, I'm primarily concerned about his anatomy, the pose of the body, the proportions of the body to other parts of it. Once I've established the anatomy is primarily established, I start adding clothing and roughing in the arms. The facial features are the most difficult part because in this scale, the face is about the size of my thumbprint. This slide, the left-hand picture shows the placement of the decoration on the coat. The right picture shows the assembled decoration. It's made out of round-headed brads and wire. The telescope is turned out on a lathe and positioned on the clay body. The flintlock is built out of epoxy resin with metal parts. This shows the positioning of the holster for the flintlock. The left picture is of the process of mounting the holster in place while the epoxy is setting up. Flintlock and sword are too fragile to be sculpted in clay. They are made to be attached to the figure after it is cast. This picture shows the completion of them painted the color of the clay. Modeling the face is the most difficult. This is the rough end of the face, rough in of the face. Making the mold for the figure begins. I remove the clay figure from the temporary base. A soft clay is used to establish the mold's parting line around the figure. Parting line. Clay are built around the figure in preparation for the first part of the rubber. This is called the gel coat, the first layer of urethane rubber. This shows the completed rubber. Clay walls that held the rubber in place have been removed, and new sets of walls have been created to hold the plaster mother mold when it's being made. The first layer of plaster mother mold with reinforced burlap. That's what this is here. So, these are the walls holding the mother mold in place. This is the first layer of plaster, which is reinforced with burlap. This shows the completed mother mold, which is that side. The mother mold's purpose is to hold the rubber in place while it's being cast. The figure has been turned over, and the new walls have been constructed to hold the rubber for the back of the mold. So if you imagine that the rubber from the back is being exposed, the rubber from the front of the figure is being exposed, that's what that yellow stuff is. And then the plaster mother mold is against this edge. You can see the white around it. And then a new set of walls is created to begin the rubber mold on the back. First rubber has been applied. I have made a pour spout and vent in preparation for the casting. This is a pour spout, and this is a vent. So if you can imagine when you're pouring this, if air is caught in this hand out here, you don't want that. So that's what that's all about. This is the completed rubber on the back side and a new set of walls built around it, and this is the plaster exposed from the front of the mold. This shows the completed mother mold and vent. Holes are drilled in the mother mold, which is right here. Okay, you see a few holes drilled around it. To hold bolts to hold the two pieces of the mold together. This shows the mold separated. This is the back of the figure. The portion, it's confusing because when you look at the image, at this point the clay and the rubber have been pulled from the mother mold. Clay has been separated from the rubber, and the rubber has been placed back in the mother mold. The parts of the mold have been cleaned, coated with separation fluids to guarantee that the parts will not stick to each other during the pour. The two halves have been bolted together and sealed to prevent leakage. The mold is positioned to do the pour. The two bolts that you see in the legs of the figure are meant to attach to the final base. This shows the front of the casting out of the mold. The parting seam of a casting has extra material called slag. The first step in finishing process is grinding the slag off the seams. Finishing the casting begins with sanding all of the surfaces, correcting anything that did not cast correctly. Sculpture is painted with platinum paint and patinaed with a warm brown. I hope this presentation you have received a new understanding of the sculpture and view it differently when you see it. I'm sure you all got some questions. Anybody got some questions?
So what is the material that it's made out of?
It's a resin plastic, the plastic, basically. Yeah, pourable plastic. Yes.
From start to finish, how long will it take you to create a statue?
I get
From the time, once you decide, what the features of
Rubber.
the statue are going to be, from the whole creating to the finished product.
the whole process takes about 2 months, approximately. A lot of that effort goes into establishing the design. Yes.
The polymer or plastic that you pour in, is it poured into the rubber? And is the rubber able to be extracted from that afterwards? Do you use any heat?
No, the plastic is a two-part resin plastic. You make it together and it hardens. That's basically what it is. It's poured into the mold, right? The mold is made out of rubber with a mother mold on the outside that holds the rubber in place while it's being poured. So the first thing that happens, you take the mother mold off, right? And then you pull the rubber off the casting.
And that comes off readily?
Hopefully, if you didn't do it right. Yes.
Yes, how do you determine your model? Is it age appropriate to the time of this time period? Are there certain captains or physique that you're looking for? How would you determine who?
Well, the first preference for all of these historic individuals is to try to show them when they accomplished their greatest goal. So Nichols would have been, what, 32 years old, something like that? Yes.
Does the mold survive? Can you reuse it?
I do so much tooling after the figure is created that the mold is really not, I mean, you could cast another piece, but you'd have to start all over again. Yes?
Not really a question, but I was very taken by the doctor speaking about the painting being in the stairwell and the eyes and stuff. I have to assume, and eyes are so important in any kind of art, and I have to assume that that was pretty important to you too, or that experience of those piercing eyes.
And in this type of sculpture, when the figure is 19 inches tall, then the facial features are about the same size as my thumb. So at that point, the clay material is almost impossible to get. It's fine detail. You do the best you can. The purpose of these sculptures is they're called maquettes, and they're basically to demonstrate traditionally to demonstrate to the client what the sculptor had in mind for the commission that the client is asking him to do. If you go to Nathaniel French's studio, you'll see 4 versions of Lincoln's monument. The first one is smaller than that piece there, with just minor detail. And then there's one there that's the final one, is 12 feet tall and about 8 by 8 on its base, something like that. And what they would have done with that piece is that would have been given to the company that turns it into the larger version in stone. But the plan to get to that stage takes a lot of... So, if for instance, Nichols was turned into a larger sculpture, then we would go to the next stage, a larger piece with more detail.
Same process.
Pretty much, yeah.
Where did you learn your trade?
Trade.
Trade. From your skills. From
Well, I was trained as a painter at the museum school. That was my, that's what I was going to do. But my wife and I got together, and she's an artist too, and we said, well, what the hell are we going to do to make a living? So we started making craft items, decorative items for the craft trade. And that led to numerous other adventures around stuff, including carousels. So you learn as you go, I guess.
It would take me a very long time.
Yes, Jack.
Well, that's kind of unfair, but along those lines, have you ever considered offering a course and doing something like this?
Before the pandemic, I gave a couple of courses. Presently have somebody working with me, but I haven't pursued that too heavily. That's a whole different headset too. Anybody else? That's it? I wore you out, huh? Okay. Thank you.